Canada. Known for its politeness, beautiful landscapes, and freezing winters. But behind that friendly reputation are some truly disturbing stories. These are real accounts from real people across the Great White North. From isolated cabins in the Yukon to suburban neighborhoods in Ontario, these 10 stories will make you think twice about our northern neighbor. My name is Marcus, and this happened 3 years ago in February 2022. I was working as a wildlife photographer in the Yukon, staying in a remote cabin about 40 kilometers from Whitehorse. I was alone for 2 weeks documenting winter wildlife. It seemed perfect until I realized someone had been watching me the entire time. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more disturbing content. The cabin was pretty standard for the area. 1 room, wood stove, no electricity, just me and the wilderness. The nearest person was a trapper named Bill who lived about 15 kilometers east. I remember the silence stood out to me. In the city, there's always noise, but out there, when the wind stopped, you could hear nothing. It was one of those places where you're truly alone. At first, everything seemed fine. I'd wake up around 6 a.m., make coffee on the stove, and head out with my camera gear. The routine was simple. I'd photograph caribou, Arctic foxes, whatever I could find, then return before dark around 4 p.m. The days were short that time of year. The first time I noticed something was off was when I came back on my 3rd day. I brushed it off at first, but the firewood I'd stacked outside the door was rearranged. Not knocked over or scattered, rearranged. Someone had restacked it differently. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe the wind, even though that didn't make sense. But then it happened again. I started noticing a pattern. Every few days, small things would be different. My snowshoes, which I always left leaning against the cabin wall, would be moved to the other side. Footprints in the snow that weren't mine would circle the cabin, then disappear into the trees. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was around 2:30 a.m. on my 8th night when things escalated. I woke up to a scraping sound outside. It sounded like metal on wood. Not like an animal scratching, more like someone dragging something across the cabin's exterior wall. I froze for a second, listening in the darkness. My heart dropped when I heard it move from the back wall to the side, then to the front door. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I just sat there in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, listening to this thing circle my cabin. It made the full loop twice, then stopped right at the door. I heard breathing. Not heavy, just steady breathing on the other side of that thin wooden door. I felt my whole body tense up. Every instinct told me to stay completely still and silent. The breathing continued for what felt like forever but was probably 5 minutes. Then I heard footsteps crunching away in the snow. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. That was unsettling, but what happened next was even worse. The following evening, I came back from shooting photos to find my cabin door wide open. I knew I'd locked it. I always locked it. Inside, nothing was stolen, but my supplies were organized differently. My food was arranged by type. My clothes were folded. Someone had been inside, and they'd spent time there. At that point, I was on edge, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. I decided to set up one of my trail cameras pointed at the cabin entrance. On the 12th night, around 1 a.m., I heard the scraping sound again. This time I felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. I just listened as whatever it was circled the cabin 3 times, then tried the door handle. It turned slowly, testing if it was locked. When it didn't open, the scraping started again, harder this time, like someone was trying to claw through the wood. And then things went from a 7 to a 10. Right as I was about to grab my satellite phone, I heard a voice. A man's voice, quiet but clear, right outside my window. He said, "I know you're awake, Marcus." He knew my name. My lungs locked up. How did he know my name? I didn't even grab my gear. I just bolted. I threw on my boots, grabbed my phone, and ran out the back window. It was -30 degrees, and I ran through the snow in the dark for over an hour until I reached Bill's place. He let me in, and we called the RCMP immediately. Realistically, the police were out there within 3 hours, but it felt like an eternity. They found the trail camera footage. It showed a man, probably in his 50s, with a long beard and winter gear. He'd been coming to my cabin every single night since I arrived. Sometimes he'd just watch. Other nights, he'd try the door or rearrange things outside. The last clip showed him standing at my window, staring in, right where I'd been sleeping. The RCMP identified him as a guy named Harold Crenshaw, wanted for breaking into remote properties across the Yukon for the past 6 years. They never caught him. He disappeared back into the wilderness. I packed up and left Canada 2 days later. To this day, I still don't know why he chose my cabin, or what he would have done if I hadn't run that night. I'll never forget his voice saying my name through that window. I never went back to the Yukon. My name is Sarah, and this happened back in 2019 when I was 26, living in a small apartment building in downtown Toronto. I had a neighbor across the hall, Unit 304, who I never thought I'd have to worry about. That changed in October of that year in a way I'll never forget. The building was pretty standard for downtown. Old, kind of run down, thin walls. I remember the hallway always smelled like curry and cigarettes. There were maybe 15 units total. I'd lived there for about 8 months when I first noticed something weird with the guy across from me. At first, everything seemed fine. He was quiet, kept to himself, maybe in his early 40s. I'd see him in the hallway sometimes, and he'd nod but never really made conversation. His name was Dale. That's all I knew about him. The first time I noticed something was off was when I found a note slipped under my door. It was handwritten, just said, "You left your window open last night. Be more careful." I brushed it off at first. I thought maybe he was just being neighborly, but my window faced an interior courtyard. You couldn't see it from the hallway. You'd have to be in the courtyard looking up to see if it was open. But then it happened again. More notes started appearing. I like the blue dress you wore on Wednesday. You came home late last night. Hope everything's okay. I started noticing a pattern. He was tracking my movements. I tried to ignore it, but each time, it got a little worse. The notes became more personal, more detailed about my daily routine. I was working as a graphic designer from home, so I was in my apartment a lot. It was around 11 p.m. on a Thursday when things escalated. I heard scratching at my door. Not knocking, scratching, like fingernails on wood. It went on for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped. I looked through the peephole and saw Dale standing there, just staring at my door. I felt my whole body tense up. The next morning, I found another note. I heard you breathing last night through the door. You sound scared. Don't be. That was it. I called the building manager, and she said she'd talk to him. That was supposed to fix it. A few days later, things went from a 5 to a 10. I woke up at exactly 3 a.m. to the sound of my doorknob turning. Back and forth, slowly, like someone was trying different amounts of pressure to see if it would open. I held my breath. Then I heard his voice through the door, barely a whisper. "I know you're listening." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At 7 a.m., I called the police. The officer came, took a report, and said unless he made a direct threat or damaged property, there wasn't much they could do. They'd talk to him. That was it. At that exact moment, while the officer was still there, Dale opened his door. He looked right at me and said, "She's overreacting, officer." I was just being friendly. The officer told him to stop contacting me and left. Dale smiled at me as his door closed. That night, I stayed at my friend Emma's place. When I came back the next day, my doorframe had scratch marks all around the lock. Deep ones, like someone had used a screwdriver or knife trying to get in. I called the police again immediately. The detective who came this time took it more seriously. They got a warrant and searched Dale's apartment. What they found made me feel nauseous. He had hundreds of photos of me, taken through my window, in the hallway, at the coffee shop I went to every morning. He'd been following me for months. He had my work schedule written out, my gym schedule, everything. They arrested him that day. Turns out, Dale had done this before to women in 2 other buildings. He'd been convicted once for stalking back in 2015, but only served 6 months. I moved out within a week and stayed with Emma for 2 months while I found a new place. They charged him with criminal harassment and attempted breaking and entering. He got 3 years. I have a restraining order that lasts until 2029. To this day, I still check every lock twice before bed. I never lived in an apartment building again. Looking back, I should have reported those first notes immediately. I'll never forget the sound of my doorknob turning that night at 3 a.m. My name is Trevor, and this happened last year during a camping trip in Algonquin Park, Ontario. I was 29, and me and 3 friends, Kyle, James, and David, decided to do a backcountry camping trip in late September. We were excited for the fall colors and some peace and quiet. What started as a relaxing weekend quickly became something none of us talk about anymore. Algonquin is massive, over 7,600 square kilometers of wilderness. We planned a 3-day trip, hiking about 15 kilometers into the backcountry where hardly anyone goes. The park was pretty quiet that time of year since most tourists stick to the main campgrounds. I remember thinking how perfect it was. No cell service, no other people, just us and nature. At first, everything seemed fine. We set up camp on the 2nd day near a small lake. The site was surrounded by dense forest, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional loon call. That first night, we made a fire, cooked dinner, and told stories. Normal camping stuff. The first time I noticed something was off was when Kyle went to get water from the lake around 10 p.m. He came back and said he thought he saw a light moving through the trees on the opposite shore. I brushed it off at first. Told him it was probably another camper with a flashlight, even though we hadn't seen anyone for hours. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. But then it happened again. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. I unzipped my tent and immediately felt wrong. The forest was completely silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. I started noticing this smell too, like wet soil and something metallic. It wasn't just me anymore. David was also awake, sitting up in his tent. He whispered, "You smell that?" We both froze. Then we heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human footsteps, crunching through the leaves, circling our campsite. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was probably a park ranger checking on campers. But rangers don't circle your camp at 2 a.m. without announcing themselves. Each time the footsteps passed, they got a little closer to our tents. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next day, we tried to laugh it off. Probably just a curious raccoon or something, we said. But when we went to the lake to wash up, we found fresh boot prints in the mud. Size 11 or 12, deep impressions like someone heavy had been standing there for a while, facing our camp. The prints led into the forest and disappeared. That was unsettling, but what happened next was even worse. That second night, things escalated fast. Around midnight, James woke everyone up. He'd heard voices. Not far away, right outside the camp. Whispering voices, too quiet to make out words. We all sat there in the dark listening. I felt my whole body tense up. The whispers would stop, then start again from a different direction. Like whoever it was kept moving around us. Kyle grabbed his flashlight and shined it into the trees. That's when we saw him. A man, maybe 30 yards out, just standing there between 2 trees. He didn't move when the light hit him. Just stood there, staring at us. My heart dropped. Kyle yelled, "Hey, can we help you?" No response. The man turned and walked deeper into the forest. At that point, I was on edge, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. We decided to take shifts staying awake. I had the 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. shift with David. At exactly 4:17 a.m. I checked my watch. We heard something that made my lungs lock up. And then things went from a 6 to a 10. At the exact same time, we both heard this sound coming from the forest. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It sounded like a woman screaming, but distorted, like someone was playing a recording at the wrong speed. The sound circled our entire campsite. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs felt like cement. Right as the sound stopped, someone started throwing rocks at our tents. Not pebbles, rocks the size of baseballs, hitting the tent fabric hard. James and Kyle scrambled out, and we all just stood there in the dark with our flashlights, scanning the trees. The rocks kept coming from different directions. Then we heard footsteps, multiple sets, running through the forest around us. Adrenaline kicked in. Without warning, one of our food bags hanging from a tree was cut down. We heard it drop, then heard someone running away with it. That's when we all looked at each other and knew we had to leave. We didn't even discuss it. We just started packing up our stuff as fast as possible in the dark. Realistically, we were out of there in under 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity in that moment. We hiked the 15 kilometers back to our car using headlamps, barely talking. It was still dark, maybe 5 a.m. None of us looked back. We called the OPP when we got cell service. They sent officers to check the area but found nothing. No footprints besides ours. No evidence of other campers. The ranger we spoke to said there had been reports of strange activity in that area before, but wouldn't give us details. To this day, we still don't know who or what was out there with us. I'll never forget that screaming sound circling our camp. I've been camping my whole life, all over Ontario. I never went back to Algonquin. Part of me wishes I knew what was happening that night, but another part is glad I don't. My name is Jennifer, and this happened 2 years ago when I was living alone in a house in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I was 32, had just gone through a divorce, and bought a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet residential neighborhood. It seemed perfect for starting fresh. Little did I know, the previous owner had left something behind. The house was pretty standard for the area, built in the 1970s, needed some updating but had good bones. I remember the basement stood out to me during the viewing. It was finished, but there was this one room with a padlock on the outside. The realtor said it was probably just storage. At first, everything seemed fine with the house. I moved in during March 2023. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families and older couples. I spent the first few weeks unpacking, painting, making it feel like home. I didn't think much about that locked basement room. I just stored some boxes down there and went about my life. The first time I noticed something was off was when I started hearing sounds from the basement at night. It was around 1 a.m., about 3 weeks after moving in. I brushed it off at first, told myself it was just the house settling or the furnace. But the sounds were rhythmic, like someone tapping on metal pipes. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. But then it happened again. The tapping became more frequent, always between 1 and 3 a.m. I started noticing a pattern. It would tap 3 times, pause, then tap 3 times again. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Each time, it got a little louder. One night, I went down to the basement to investigate. The tapping stopped the second I reached the bottom of the stairs. I checked the furnace, the water heater, everything. Nothing seemed wrong. But when I walked past that locked room, I felt my whole body tense up. The door was cold to the touch, and I heard this faint scratching sound from inside. That was unsettling, but what happened next was even worse. I decided to cut off the padlock. This was my house, after all. I had a right to see what was in there. When I opened the door, the smell hit me immediately. Musty, like old paper and something else I couldn't identify. The room was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet. The walls were covered in writing. Hundreds of lines of text, written directly on the drywall in black marker. Dates, names, phrases that made no sense. I started reading them. March 3rd, it's getting closer. March 10th, I hear it in the walls. March 17th, it knows I'm here. The dates went back 5 years. The handwriting got more frantic as the dates progressed. The last entry was dated February 28th, 2023, just a week before I moved in. It said, "I can't stay here anymore. If you're reading this, get out while you can." At that point, I was on edge, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. That night, the tapping started again. But this time, it was coming from inside that room. I had left the door open. I went downstairs and stood in the doorway. My hands were shaking. The tapping was coming from behind the walls, moving across the room like something was crawling through the space between the studs. And then things went from a 5 to a 10. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the tapping stopped. I heard breathing. Not my breathing, someone else's breathing, coming from that room. I felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. Then I saw movement in the darkness. A shadow, darker than the surrounding black, shifted in the corner of that room. Right then, I heard a voice. Quiet, barely audible, but clear enough to understand. It said, "He wrote all that for you." I didn't even grab anything. I bolted up the stairs, grabbed my car keys, and drove to my sister's house. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I called the police in the morning. They came and searched the house but found nothing. No signs of a break-in, no evidence of anyone being there. The officer said the writing on the walls was probably just the previous owner's way of coping with mental health issues. They couldn't do anything about breathing sounds and shadows. I hired a contractor to investigate the walls in that room. We found out later that there were gaps in the ductwork that connected to the neighbor's house next door. Sounds were traveling through the system. But that didn't explain the shadow or the voice. Turns out, the previous owner, a man named Richard Bellows, had lived there alone for 15 years. He had multiple police reports filed for disturbances, but nothing was ever substantiated. He moved to a care facility in February 2023. I sold the house 3 months later and took a loss. I never spent another night there after that experience. To this day, I still don't know what was in that basement room with me. Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts when I first saw that locked door. I'll never forget that voice saying, "He wrote all that for you." It completely changed how I approach buying houses. I still get chills when I think about it. My name is Daniel, and this happened 3 years ago during a road trip across British Columbia. I was 27 and driving from Vancouver to Prince George alone, about a 12-hour drive. I'd made the trip before, so I knew the route. What I didn't expect was what would happen on a lonely stretch of Highway 97 at 3 a.m. The highway was pretty standard for BC, long stretches through forests, not many towns, occasional gas stations. I remember thinking how peaceful it was driving at night. No traffic, just me and the road. At first, everything seemed fine. I'd left Vancouver around 6 p.m., planning to drive through the night and arrive by morning. The first time I noticed something was off was around 2 a.m., somewhere between Cache Creek and Williams Lake. I saw a car pulled over on the side of the road with its hazards on. I brushed it off at first. People break down all the time. But as I passed, I saw someone standing outside the vehicle, just staring at the road. They didn't wave for help, didn't move. Just stood there. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. But then it happened again. About 30 kilometers later, I saw another car pulled over. Same thing, hazards on, person standing outside, completely still. This time I felt uneasy. I started noticing a pattern. Every 20 to 30 kilometers, there was another car. Same setup. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was probably some kind of rally or organized event. But at 2 a.m., on a random Tuesday in October, each time I passed one, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The roads were completely empty otherwise. No other moving vehicles, no transport trucks, nothing. Just these parked cars with people standing outside them. I counted 7 of them over about 2 hours of driving. My heart rate started picking up. That was unsettling, but what happened next was even worse. Around 3 a.m., I saw headlights behind me. Finally, Another car moving. But something felt wrong about it. The car was matching my speed exactly. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down. It stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind me for at least 40 kilometers. I felt my whole body tense up. I decided to pull into a rest stop to let them pass. There was a small parking area with bathrooms coming up. I pulled in, and the car behind me pulled in too. My hands were shaking. The car parked about 50 feet away, engine running, headlights on. I could see 2 figures in the front seat, just sitting there, not getting out, not moving, just watching me. At that point, I was on edge, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, then decided to keep driving. I pulled back onto the highway, and immediately, they followed. This time, they got closer. 2 car lengths behind me. Then 1 car length. I could feel my pulse in my ears. And then things went from a 6 to a 10. Right as I was coming up on another one of those parked cars with someone standing outside, my phone rang. Unknown number. I don't know why I answered. A man's voice said, "Keep driving. Don't stop for anything." Then he hung up. My lungs locked up. At the exact same time, the car behind me flashed its high beams 3 times. Then fell back. Then sped up and got right on my bumper. I pressed the gas pedal down, hitting 140 kilometers per hour. The car stayed right behind me. Every instinct told me not to stop. Then I saw the next parked car ahead. But this time, the person standing outside stepped into the road. Stepped right into my lane, arms raised like they wanted me to stop. Without warning, I swerved into the oncoming lane to avoid them. The car behind me didn't swerve. It went straight at the person, who dove out of the way at the last second. That's when I realized what was happening. This wasn't random. Someone was using those parked cars to get people to stop. And the car behind me was trying to keep me from falling for it. Adrenaline kicked in. I didn't slow down for the next hour. The car stayed behind me, maintaining distance now, almost like an escort. At 4:30 a.m., I reached Williams Lake. The car behind me pulled into a gas station, and I did too. I needed answers. When I got out, it was an RCMP officer in an unmarked car. He looked exhausted. He said, "You're the 4th person I've guided through tonight. Don't ask questions. Just be glad you didn't stop." I asked what was happening. He said there had been reports of a group targeting lone drivers on that stretch of highway for the past 2 weeks. They'd pose as stranded motorists, and when someone stopped to help, they'd rob them. Sometimes worse. The officer had been patrolling, watching for potential victims. That phone call was him warning me. Realistically, I was out of danger at that point, but it felt like an eternity before my heart rate returned to normal. The RCMP increased patrols on that highway, and 3 suspects were arrested a week later. Turns out, they'd been doing this for months across BC and Alberta. They never explained what sometimes worse meant. I didn't want to know. I drove the rest of the way to Prince George as the sun came up. To this day, I still don't drive that route at night. Looking back, I should have called 911 the moment I saw the second parked car. I'll never forget that voice on the phone saying, "Keep driving. Don't stop for anything." It completely changed how I approach nighttime driving on remote highways. I still get chills when I think about what might have happened if I'd pulled over to help one of those people. My name is Christine, and this happened back in 2020 during the pandemic, when I was 30 and staying at my family's cottage in Muskoka, Ontario. With everyone working from home, I figured I'd spend a few weeks at our cottage on Lake Rousseau. It was off-season, so the neighboring cottages were empty. I thought it would be peaceful. I was wrong. The cottage was pretty standard for the area. 2 bedrooms, right on the water, surrounded by trees. I remember how quiet it was stood out to me. During the summer, the lake is full of boats and people, but in November, it was deserted. It was one of those places where you could go days without seeing another person. At first, everything seemed fine. I'd been there for about a week, working during the day, reading at night. The routine was simple and relaxing. I'd make dinner, sit by the fireplace, and enjoy the silence. It was exactly what I needed. The first time I noticed something was off was when I saw a canoe tied to our dock. It wasn't ours. We kept our boat in storage for the winter. I brushed it off at first. Told myself maybe a neighbor had docked there temporarily, even though all the other cottages were clearly closed up for the season. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. But then it happened again. The next morning, the canoe was gone, but there were wet footprints on our dock leading up to the cottage. I started noticing a pattern. Every morning, there were new signs someone had been there. A window screened slightly ajar. Our outdoor chair moved. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Each time, the signs got closer to the actual cottage. It was around 11 p.m. on my 10th night when things escalated. I was reading in bed when I heard splashing. Someone was in the water near our dock. I turned off my light and looked out the window. I felt my whole body tense up. There was a figure in the lake, maybe 20 feet from shore, just floating there. Not swimming, not moving, just floating, facing the cottage. I watched for about 10 minutes. The figure didn't move. Then it slowly swam to our dock, climbed out, and stood there dripping wet in the moonlight. I held my breath. The person, I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, walked up our dock, stood at the shore end for a moment, then walked back to the water and swam away. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it. That was unsettling, but what happened next was even worse. The following night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I even pushed a chair against the back door for extra security. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to tapping on my bedroom window. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. Over and over. My hands were shaking. I couldn't see anyone outside. The tapping continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At sunrise, I went outside to check. There were handprints on my bedroom window. Not just a few, dozens of them, all over the glass. Like someone had been pressing their hands against it repeatedly. I felt nauseous. At that point, I was on edge, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. I called the OPP non-emergency line and filed a report. They said they'd send an officer, but it might take a few hours since I was in a remote area. I decided to stay inside with all the lights on until they arrived. And then things went from a 5 to a 10. At exactly 3:30 p.m., while it was still daylight, I heard the back door handle turning. Not jiggling like someone was trying to get in, turning like someone had a key. But I'd pushed that chair against it. The door pushed open slightly, hit the chair, then closed. Then it pushed again, harder. The chair scraped across the floor. Right then, I heard a voice from outside. A woman's voice, calm and clear. "Christine, I just want to talk." She knew my name. My lungs locked up. How did she know my name? I grabbed my phone and ran to the front door. As I opened it, I saw her coming around the side of the cottage. A woman, maybe 40s, soaking wet, with long dark hair plastered to her face. I didn't even grab my car keys. I just ran to my car and locked myself inside. She walked up to my driver's side window and put her hand on the glass. She said, "I live here now. This is mine." Then she smiled. Every instinct told me to drive away immediately. I reversed out of the driveway so fast I nearly hit a tree. I drove straight to the nearest town, Gravenhurst, about 30 minutes away. The OPP met me there. I told them everything. They drove back to the cottage with me and searched the property. They found signs someone had been living in our boathouse. Blankets, food wrappers, empty water bottles. There was even a journal with entries about watching the woman in the cottage. The last entry was from that morning. Today, I'll introduce myself. The woman matched the description of someone reported missing from Barrie 2 months earlier. Her name was Angela Whitmore. She'd had a mental health crisis and walked away from her group home. The OPP found her that evening, still at our cottage. She was confused, didn't seem to understand she was trespassing. They took her to a hospital for evaluation. We found out later that she'd been staying in various empty cottages along Lake Rosso all fall. Ours was the first one where someone was actually there. The psychiatrist said she'd become fixated on the idea that she owned the cottages she stayed in. She wasn't violent, but she needed help. She was placed in a long-term care facility. I left the cottage that same day and didn't go back until the following summer, and even then, only with my brother there. To this day, I still check the boathouse every time I visit. Looking back, I should have called the police the moment I saw that canoe. I'll never forget her hand on my car window saying, "This is mine." It completely changed how I feel about staying at isolated places alone. I still get chills when I think about how many nights she'd been watching me before she knocked. My name is Robert, and this happened 5 years ago when I was working as a security guard at an old hospital in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The building had been abandoned since 2015 and was scheduled for demolition. I was 35, needed the money, and figured watching an empty building overnight would be easy work. What started as a simple job quickly became something that still haunts me. The hospital was pretty massive for the area. 4 floors, over 200 rooms, built in 1923. I remember the architecture stood out to me. Old brick, long hallways, that institutional smell that never quite goes away even after a building sits empty. It was one of those places where you could feel the history, and not in a good way. At first, everything seemed fine. My shift was 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 nights a week. The job was simple. Walk through each floor twice per shift, check that all doors were secured, make sure no homeless people or vandals had gotten in. The building was scheduled to come down in 3 months, so really I was just there to prevent liability issues. I didn't expect any problems. The first time I noticed something was off was during my second night. I was doing my midnight rounds on the 3rd floor when I heard a door close somewhere ahead of me. I brushed it off at first. Old buildings make noise. Doors don't always latch properly. Wind can push them. I told myself it was probably nothing. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. But then it happened again. The next night, same floor, same time. A door closing, then footsteps in the hallway ahead of me. I called out, "Security, anyone here?" No response. I started noticing a pattern. Every night, around midnight, I'd hear activity on the 3rd floor. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just the building settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Each time, the sounds got closer to where I was standing. It was around 12:30 a.m. on my 7th night when things escalated. I was walking down the main corridor on the 3rd floor when I saw a shadow move across the wall at the end of the hallway. Not a vague shadow, a clear human-shaped silhouette, moving from one room to another. I felt my whole body tense up. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed toward the room. My hands were shaking. When I got there, the door was open. I shined my light inside. It was an old patient room, completely empty except for a rusty bed frame. But the window was closed. No way anyone could have left. I checked the hallway both directions. Nobody. The floor was covered in dust, and I could see my own footprints clearly. There were no other prints. That was unsettling, but what happened next was even worse. I started finding things moved around. Medical equipment that had been left in storage rooms would be arranged differently. Old wheelchairs lined up in hallways where they definitely hadn't been before. Filing cabinets opened. And every single time, it was on the 3rd floor. I started avoiding that floor as much as possible during my rounds. 2 weeks in, things went from manageable to genuinely frightening. Around 1 a.m., I was on the 2nd floor when I heard what sounded like someone running above me. Full-on sprinting down the hallway directly over my head. The sound went the full length of the building, maybe 100 meters, then stopped abruptly. My heart dropped. I held my breath and listened. Then the running started again, this time going back the other direction. I called my supervisor and told him I thought someone had broken in. He said to check it out and called police if I confirmed an intruder. I did not want to go up to that third floor, but I needed the job. Every instinct told me not to go up there, but I forced myself. At that point, I was on edge, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. When I opened the stairwell door to the third floor, the smell hit me. This overwhelming scent of antiseptic and something else, decay or rot, I couldn't identify it. The smell hadn't been there on my previous rounds. I stepped into the hallway with my flashlight, and that's when I saw them. And then things went from a 6 to a 10. Every single door along the corridor was wide open. All 30 or 40 rooms on that floor. I had personally checked them all 2 hours earlier. Every door had been closed. At the exact same time I realized this, I heard a sound from the far end of the hall. It sounded like a gurney rolling, that distinctive squeak of old wheels. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it getting closer. Right as the sound reached about halfway down the hall toward me, all the doors started closing. Not slowly, slamming, one after another in sequence, like dominoes falling. The sound was deafening in that empty building. Boom, 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 boom. I felt paralyzed. My lungs locked up. The doors kept slamming shut, moving toward me, getting closer and closer. When the wave of slamming doors was maybe 10 feet away, I bolted. I ran to the stairwell and didn't stop until I was outside the building. I called my supervisor immediately and told him I was done. He actually laughed at first, thought I was joking. When he realized I was serious, he told me to file a report and he'd send someone else to finish the shift. I didn't even go back for my jacket. I drove straight home, and I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I called and quit. My supervisor said 2 other guards had quit in the past year for similar reasons, but he thought they were making excuses. He told me the hospital had a history. Between 1923 and 1970, it was a tuberculosis sanatorium. Over 400 people died there. After that, it was a general hospital until funding ran out in 2015. They never found any evidence of break-ins. No footprints, no signs of vandalism, nothing. The building was demolished in April 2019. The new security guard they hired lasted 3 nights before he quit too. To this day, I still don't know what was on that third floor with me. Part of me wishes I knew, but another part is glad I don't. I'll never forget the sound of those doors slamming in sequence, moving toward me. I've worked security for 15 years, in all kinds of places. I never took another job in an abandoned building. Looking back, I should have quit after the first week. It completely changed how I view old hospitals and institutions. I still get chills when I think about that gurney sound in the darkness. My name is Amanda, and this happened 4 years ago in the winter of 2021. I was 28 and teaching at a small elementary school in rural Saskatchewan, near a town called Meadow Lake. I was renting a farmhouse about 10 kilometers outside of town because the rent was cheap and I liked the isolation. It seemed perfect until I found the photographs. The farmhouse was pretty old, probably built in the 1950s. 2 stories, wooden siding that needed paint, surrounded by flat prairie and some scraggly trees. I remember how the wind stood out to me, constant, howling, especially at night. It was one of those places where you could see for miles in every direction. At first, everything seemed fine. I'd been living there for about 3 months, from September through November. The landlord was an older man named Frank who lived in town. He'd inherited the property from his uncle who'd passed away earlier that year. The house came partially furnished, which was convenient. I didn't ask too many questions. The first time I noticed something was off was when I was cleaning out the bedroom closet to make space for my winter clothes. Behind some old boxes, I found a showbox. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. I brushed it off at first, figured they were just family photos the previous owner had left behind. But as I looked through them, I started to feel uneasy. The photos were all of the same woman. Different ages, different years based on the clothing and photo quality. Some looked like they were from the 1970s, others more recent, maybe 2010s. But it wasn't just portraits. Some of the photos were taken from a distance, like surveillance photos. The woman walking to her car. The woman at a grocery store. The woman through a window. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a private investigator's files or something. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. But then it happened again. I found more boxes. In the basement, in the attic, hidden in kitchen cabinets. All filled with photographs of different women. Hundreds of photos. I started noticing a pattern. Each woman appeared in 20 or 30 photos, then a new woman would appear. Like someone was systematically documenting these people. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Each box I found made me more uncomfortable. It was around 10 p.m. on a Friday when things escalated. I decided to call Frank and ask him about the photos. He sounded confused at first, said his uncle was a photographer, did a lot of portrait work. I asked him about the surveillance-style photos. There was a long pause. Then Frank said, "What do you mean, surveillance photos?" I explained what I'd found. He told me he'd come by tomorrow to look at them. I felt my whole body tense up. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those photos. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. I looked out my bedroom window and saw headlights in the driveway. A truck I didn't recognize. Someone got out, walked up to the house, and tried the front door handle. My hands were shaking. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911. The person walked around the house, testing windows. I could hear them trying each one. Then they went to the basement window well on the side of the house. I heard glass breaking. That was it. I called 911 immediately. The RCMP said they'd send someone, but it would take at least 20 minutes. I was in the middle of nowhere. That was unsettling, but what happened next was even worse. I heard footsteps in the basement. Heavy boots on the concrete floor. Then I heard them on the stairs, coming up to the main floor. I'd locked my bedroom door, but that wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. I could feel my pulse in my ears. At that point, I was on edge, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. I heard breathing on the other side. Then a man's voice, older, raspy, "Where are my photographs?" He tried the door handle. It was locked. He tried again, then started kicking the door. The frame was old wood. It wouldn't hold long. And then things went from a 7 to a 10. Right as the door frame started to splinter, I heard sirens in the distance. At the exact same time, the kicking stopped. I heard the person run back downstairs and out through the basement. By the time the RCMP arrived, he was gone. They found his truck abandoned at the end of my driveway. Stolen plates. No way to identify the driver. The officers took all the photographs as evidence. They searched the property and found more boxes buried in the yard. Thousands of photos going back 40 years. Turns out, Frank's uncle, a man named Edward Pritchard, had been investigated in the 1990s for stalking but never charged. The women in the most recent photos were all located and interviewed. 3 of them had restraining orders against Edward. 2 of them didn't know they'd been photographed at all. Edward had died in July 2021, supposedly from natural causes. But someone had broken into my house looking for those photos. The RCMP believed it was an accomplice, someone who'd been helping Edward and wanted to destroy the evidence. They never caught him. DNA from the basement window didn't match anyone in the system. I moved out the next day. Stayed with another teacher in town until I found a new place. Frank felt terrible, said he had no idea about his uncle's activities. The house was eventually sold to a developer who tore it down. To this day, I still don't know who broke in that night or what they would have done if the RCMP hadn't arrived. Part of me wishes I knew, but another part is glad I don't. I'll never forget that voice through the door saying, "Where are my photographs?" I lived in Saskatchewan for 1 more year, then moved to Ontario. I never lived in an isolated rural area again. Looking back, I should have left the moment I found those first photos. It completely changed how I vet rental properties. I still get chills when I think about those photographs and how many women were in them. My name is Eric, and this happened last year during the summer of 2024. I was 31 and working as a kayak tour guide in the Bay of Fundy, New Brunswick. I'd been doing tours for 3 years, knew the waters well, never had any serious incidents. What started as a normal day on the water quickly became the most terrifying experience of my life. The Bay of Fundy is known for having the highest tides in the world, up to 16 meters difference between high and low tide. The tours were pretty standard. I'd take groups of 4 to 6 people out for 3-hour trips along the coast, showing them sea caves and watching for whales. I remember the weather that day stood out to me. Perfect conditions, calm water, clear skies. It was one of those ideal days for kayaking. At first, everything seemed fine. My group that morning was 4 people, 2 couples from Toronto who'd booked online. They seemed experienced with kayaking, had good gear, followed instructions. We launched from St. Martin's around 9 a.m., planning to paddle along the coast and explore some caves before the tide changed. The first time I noticed something was off was when we were about 2 kilometers from shore. One of the couples, Mark and Lisa, stopped paddling and pointed at something in the water. At first, I brushed it off, probably a seal or porpoise, I thought. But as we got closer, I saw it was debris. A lot of debris. Pieces of fiberglass, life jackets, a cooler, all floating together. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. I radioed the Coast Guard to report it. They said they'd send someone to check it out and asked for our location. I gave them the coordinates and we kept moving. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe someone's boat had capsized in a storm and the wreckage finally washed in. But the other couple, David and Sarah, seemed spooked. I tried to ignore their anxiety, but I started noticing they kept looking behind us. It was around 10:30 a.m. when things started to feel wrong. We were near the entrance to a large sea cave when David said he saw someone in the water behind us. I turned around and saw what looked like a person floating face down about 50 meters away. My heart dropped. I told everyone to stay together and paddled toward it. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a person. It was a wetsuit, inflated and floating, but empty. No body inside. Just the suit, bobbing in the waves. I felt my whole body tense up. That's when I saw the second one. And the third. 5 empty wetsuits, all floating in the same area. Someone had deliberately inflated them and left them there. That was unsettling, but what happened next was even worse. I heard an engine. A boat, moving fast, coming from deeper water. It was a fishing boat, maybe 30 feet long, but something felt wrong about the way it was moving. Erratic, zigzagging. As it got closer, I could see someone at the wheel, but they were hunched over, not standing upright like you normally would. The boat came straight at us. Not toward us, at us, on a collision course. I screamed for everyone to paddle toward the cave entrance. My hands were shaking. The boat kept coming. At the last second, maybe 20 feet away, it turned hard to starboard and circled us. The engine was loud, drowning out everything else. I could feel my pulse in my ears. At that point, I was on edge, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. The boat made 3 full circles around our kayaks, getting tighter with each loop. I could see the person at the wheel now, a man, maybe 50s, wearing a fishing jacket. But his eyes were wrong. Vacant. He was staring straight ahead, not at us, just staring at nothing. Every instinct told me something was very wrong with this situation. And then things went from a 6 to a 10. Right as the boat finished its 3rd circle, it stopped. The engine cut out. Complete silence except for the waves. At the exact same time, the man at the wheel turned and looked directly at me. His mouth moved like he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Then he raised his arm and pointed at the cave entrance behind us. Without warning, he started the engine again and gunned it straight at the cave wall. Full throttle, no hesitation. The boat smashed into the rocks at the cave entrance. The sound was deafening, metal and fiberglass crashing, the engine screaming. I felt paralyzed. The boat started sinking immediately. I snapped out of it and paddled toward the wreckage. The man was thrown from the boat on impact. I reached him in maybe 30 seconds. He was bleeding from his head, barely conscious, floating in his life jacket. I grabbed him and started towing him back to my group. David helped me get him onto the back of my kayak. Adrenaline kicked in. The man kept mumbling something. I couldn't understand him at first, but then it became clear. He was saying they're in the cave. They're still in the cave. Over and over. My lungs locked up. I looked at the cave entrance. That's when I saw them. There were people inside the cave. 3 people, standing in the shallow water at the back, watching us. They weren't moving, weren't calling for help. Just standing there, in chest-deep water. Just watching. The tide was coming in. In 30 minutes, that cave would be completely underwater. I yelled at them to come out. No response. They just stared. I radioed the Coast Guard again, told them we had an emergency, gave them the location. They said they were 10 minutes out. The man on my kayak grabbed my arm and said, "Don't go in there. They're already gone." I didn't understand what he meant. Realistically, the Coast Guard arrived in under 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity in that moment. They pulled the man from the water and sent a team into the cave. When they came out, their faces were pale. The 3 people in the cave weren't alive. They'd been dead for at least 24 hours. They were tied to posts that had been driven into the cave floor, positioned so they'd be standing upright even after death. The incoming tide had been moving them, making them appear to sway. We found out later that the man who crashed the boat was named Richard Hayes. He was a local fisherman who discovered the bodies early that morning while checking his lobster traps. What he saw broke something in his mind. He'd called 911 but then took his boat back out, apparently trying to warn people away from the area. The crash was accidental. He was having some kind of mental breakdown. The 3 victims were hikers from Maine who'd gone missing 4 days earlier. They'd been kayaking in the area and never returned. The RCMP believed they were murdered by someone who knew the tide schedules. The investigation is still ongoing. They have suspects but no arrests yet. I quit guiding tours the next week. I couldn't go back on the water. To this day, I still see those 3 figures standing in that cave when I close my eyes. The way they swayed with the tide, like they were watching us. I'll never forget that. I moved to Alberta 3 months later. I never went back to the Bay of Fundy. Part of me wishes I could forget what I saw that day, but I know I never will. It completely changed everything for me. I still get chills when I think about it. My name is Thomas, and this happened 6 years ago when I was 26 and working at a lumber mill outside Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. I was on the night shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., running one of the saws. It was decent money and I didn't mind working alone. What I didn't know was that I wasn't actually alone. Little did I know, someone had been living in the mill for weeks. The mill was pretty big, about 50,000 square feet of workspace, high ceilings, lots of machinery and lumber stacks. I remember how loud it was stood out to me. Even with ear protection, the saws and equipment made it impossible to hear anything else. It was one of those industrial places where you felt small. At first, everything seemed fine. My job was straightforward. Load lumber onto the saw, cut to specification, stack it, repeat. There were usually 3 to 4 other workers on the night shift in different areas of the mill, but we rarely saw each other. The building was too big and everyone had their own section. I didn't expect any problems. The first time I noticed something was off was when I found my lunch missing from the break room fridge. It was around 2 a.m. during my break. I brushed it off at first, figured one of the other guys took it by mistake, but it kept happening. 3 nights in a row, my lunch would disappear. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. But then it happened again. I started finding other things moved around in the break room. My jacket relocated to a different hook. My thermos cap unscrewed. I started noticing a pattern. Someone was messing with my stuff specifically. The other workers said they hadn't noticed anything unusual. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was around 3 a.m. on my 8th night when things escalated. I shut down my saw to change the blade. In the sudden silence, I heard something. Footsteps on the metal catwalk above me. Heavy boots, moving slowly. I looked up but couldn't see anyone in the dim lighting. I felt my whole body tense up. I called out, "Hey, someone up there." No answer. The footsteps stopped. I figured it was one of the other workers taking a shortcut. But when I went to the break room at 4 a.m., I asked everyone if they'd been on the catwalks near my section. They all said no. One of them, a guy named Darren, said he'd heard rumors that homeless people sometimes broke into the mill to sleep during the day when it was closed. My hands were shaking thinking about someone being up there while I was working. That was unsettling, but what happened next was even worse. The next night, I brought a better flashlight. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, I immediately climbed the stairs to the catwalk. When I got up there, I saw something that made my heart drop. There was a sleeping bag rolled up behind some lumber stacks. Next to it were food wrappers, water bottles, and a backpack. Someone was living up there. I radioed security immediately. They said they'd send someone. I went back down to my saw and tried to keep working, but I was on edge. I kept looking up at the catwalk. About 20 minutes later, I saw movement. A figure emerged from behind the lumber stacks and climbed down a ladder on the far side of the mill. They moved fast, like they knew the layout well. At that point, I was nervous, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. Security searched the mill but found nothing. The sleeping bag and supplies were gone. They checked all the exits. Everything was locked from the inside. Whoever it was, they were still in the building. Security told me and the other night shift workers to stay alert and work in pairs if possible. But that wasn't really feasible given our job assignments. And then things went from a 5 to a 10. At exactly 4:17 a.m., I remember because I checked my watch, all the lights in my section went out. Complete darkness except for the emergency exit signs. My saw was still running, but I couldn't see anything. At the exact same time, I heard someone running toward me. Fast, heavy footsteps getting closer in the darkness. Right then, I hit the emergency stop button for my saw. In the sudden silence, I heard breathing. Someone was standing maybe 10 feet away from me in the dark, breathing hard. I fumbled for my flashlight and finally got it on. There was a man standing there, maybe 40s, filthy clothes, wild beard. He raised his hand to block the light and said, "Turn that off." Every instinct told me to run. And I did. I bolted toward the exit, which was about 50 meters away. I heard him chasing me. I could hear his boots pounding on the concrete floor behind me. My lungs locked up. I reached the door, threw it open, and ran outside into the parking lot. I kept running until I reached the security office. Security called the RCMP immediately. Officers arrived within 10 minutes and searched the entire mill. Realistically, it took them over an hour to find him. He'd climbed into a space between the roof and the ceiling where ventilation equipment was stored. They had to coax him out. His name was Dennis Barker, 43 years old, with a history of mental illness and addiction. He'd been living in the mill for almost a month, coming and going through a loading dock door that had a faulty lock. The RCMP said he wasn't violent, just desperate and mentally unwell. He'd been stealing food and supplies from workers to survive. The night the lights went out, he'd hit the breaker because he was trying to hide when security was searching. He panicked when he realized I was still there in the dark. They arrested him for break and enter, and he was eventually placed in a treatment program. The mill management fixed all the locks and improved security, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I transferred to the day shift 2 weeks later. To this day, I still think about how many nights I worked there with him watching me from above. Looking back, I should have reported those first missing lunches to security immediately. I'll never forget his voice in the darkness saying, "Turn that off." It completely changed how I feel about working alone in large buildings. I still get chills when I think about how close he got to me that night. That's the final story. 10 disturbing experiences from across Canada. From the Yukon to the Maritimes, from isolated wilderness to suburban neighborhoods, these stories prove that horror doesn't respect borders. If any of these resonated with you, or if you have your own Canadian horror story, drop it in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that really happened. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more disturbing stories. Until next time, stay safe out there.